Apathy, on behalf of the Democratic Party of DuPage County and Indivisible Naperville, welcome to MLK Day Forum of Action. I am Diane McGuire, co-founder and co-leader with Nancy Turner of Indivisible Naperville, and I will be moderating this panel discussion today on voter rights in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday. During the summer of 1964, a coalition of civil rights groups and almost 1,000 student volunteers converged in Mississippi to register African American voters. And let's pause a moment when we consider that number. 1,000 student volunteers number. The Mississippi Summer Project was met with unrelenting violence. There were 1,000 arrests, 35 shootings, 30 bombed buildings, 35 burned churches, 80 beatings, and at least 6 murders over a very short period of time. And during this same period of time, Martin Luther King vowed to continue fighting for the right to vote, to earn, and to learn without racial barriers. From Dr. King's speech on the final day of the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in March of 1965, just a few months later. This is his quote: "Let's march on ballot boxes. Let's march on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena. Let us march on ballot boxes until the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs will be transformed into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens." Less than 5 months later, on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act became law. Now, this historic landmark civil rights legislation did the following, among other things, but these 3 big provisions were part of it. It prohibited tactics designed to eradicate the African American vote, such as poll taxes and literacy tests. It allowed federal examiners, and this is key, not only to oversee elections, but also to register voters. And it gave the United States Attorney General the power to pre-approve voting and election changes in places with a history of discrimination. They were all in the southern part of our country. And the effects were felt almost immediately. Within months of its passage, 250,000 new Black voters were registered to vote, a third of them by federal examiners. Within 4 years, voter registration in the South had more than doubled. And in 1965, remember Mississippi, the Mississippi Summer Project. In 1965, just months after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Mississippi led the nation in both African American turnout at 74% and in the number of African American leaders elected to office. And in 1969, African American turnout in Tennessee was 92.1%. In Arkansas, 77.9%, and in Texas, 73.1%. Now let's fast forward 40 years with the candidacy of Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. Voter turnout was the most diverse in American history, and it closed that long-standing gap between white and non-white voter participation. So how did the nation react? Shamefully, lawmakers nationwide responded to this historic moment by reinstating barriers to every step of the voting process. And it can be rather subtle and not so subtle, restricting the types of identification required to vote, cutting early voting periods, severely restricting voter registration drives, purging of voter rolls of qualified voters. And as we saw in Wisconsin last week, doing away with all drop boxes across the state of Wisconsin. And with the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder decision by the Supreme Court, that federal oversight that was so key in the first Voting Rights Act was overturned. And in 2021, with the Supreme Court decision in Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee, further erosion of party voters and the methods of voting occurred. And that brings us to today's panel discussion regarding current efforts to restore oversight provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the setting of national standards for federal elections across this country. Our panelists today are so distinguished and so accomplished. Illinois State Representative Ann Stava Murray, Illinois State Central Committeeman for the 6th Congressional District, Patrick Watson, and Chairman of the Democratic Party of DuPage County, Ken Mejia Beal. And we'll start the discussion today with each of our panelists briefly introducing themselves to our audience and sharing with us to this panel today. Why is this discussion regarding voter suppression efforts underway across this nation such an important topic for them? And we'll start with Ken and then move to Ann and conclude with Patrick. So we'll start with Ken Mejia Beal.
Thank you so much, Diane. And my name is Ken Mejia Beal. I'm the chair of the Democratic Party of DuPage County, and I am the first African-American chair to hold that title here. The reason that this day and this movement means so much to me is because as the chair of a party, it's important that people have access to the ballots. It's also important to me that people are allowed to vote for folks that share their common interests and understand their lives. So that's why I'm here, and that is why talking about voting rights is so important to me. Thank you.
And so I'm Ann Stava. Yep, I'm State Representative Ann Stava Murray, and I'm the State Representative to the 81st District. And I'm here tonight because voting rights are the bedrock of our democracy. They're the absolute foundation. Without voting rights, we cannot call ourselves a full democracy. And I think that that is absolutely essential and core. And I think we know our shameful past as a country, and our shameful present, unfortunately, is underway. And we're currently hearing arguments that segregationists used back in the 1960s that are against some of these newer provisions that we're trying to enact. So I think it's a really dangerous time for voting rights. And I think it's a time that we all have to educate ourselves. And I actually had to educate myself for this panel tonight. And I look forward to helping all of us understand what's at risk and what we really need to stand up for here. So thank you so much for having me.
And Patrick, sorry.
Hello, my name is Patrick Watson, and I'm the Democratic State Central Committeeman for the Illinois 6th Congressional District. I was the first African-American Central Committeeman outside of a district that did not touch Chicago. Overall, the first in the collar counties, the first anywhere in the state outside of Cook County. I'm passionate about this because voting rights and human rights are absolutely crucial for our democracy. In order for us to proceed forth with a lot of the things that we want to achieve, we have to make sure that everyone's vote counts. I remember one of my first jobs on a campaign was the Obama campaign, and one of my areas was Gadsden County in Florida. This was a rural area that had a large African-American population, and a lot of the people that had gone on to become elected officials, went on to become mayors, went on to take on other offices, they spoke to me about a lot of the struggles that they faced. They talked about the FBI having to come in and monitor polling locations. They talked about all of these things that had happened fairly recently within my lifetime that they had to endure, and just how proud they were to see President Obama and how proud they were to be elected to these offices. If we don't protect voting rights, a lot of these things are going to go away in these states and states near us in our own states.
Thank you, Patrick. Secondly, let's talk about the two major pieces of legislation that are sort of hovering over all of us right now. Hopefully they will be considered in the Senate at some point. They should be. They were almost, and we all know what's standing in the way. The Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I'd like our panelists to take each of these pieces of legislation, kind of give us a summary of where you think the salient points are and what we need to pay attention to. And I'm going to start with Ken and his focus on the Freedom to Vote Act.
Yeah, so the Freedom to Vote Act in a nutshell is kind of a boost to the John Lewis bill, which I believe Ann and Patrick will discuss. So what this bill does, it is the first to set a national standard on the right to vote. So what it does is it increases, the goal is to increase our mail-in voting and to really look at our voter registration to make it easier to register folks to vote, and to restore the right to vote to folks that are incarcerated, which is something that is very important because incarcerated people are considered parts of the population. When you look at congressional districts, that comes into play. The second is the second part of this act is to eliminate extreme gerrymandering. So there are certain states where you can look at a map and you can tell this is who they want to get elected. And these are the people they don't want in this district. So it's important that nationally we have gerrymandering standards so that folks are allowed to elect their elected officials and not elected officials deciding who their voters should be. So that is the freedom bill in a nutshell.
Yes. And
Okay, for Ann. Oh, go ahead, Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
For the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, so Diane did a great job of reviewing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the two relatively recent Supreme Court decisions that gutted key provisions in the law. I'm going to delve in a little bit deeper to those two Supreme Court cases because I think they really highlight the provisions of the new act and why they're so necessary. So again, the Voting Rights Act, we know, was designed to ensure state and local governments do not pass laws or policies that deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on their race. So the Voting Rights Act was actually one of the most successful civil rights legislation in our country's history. Diane gave some good statistics on it. Another statistic I saw was that the gap in racial participation countrywide was down to 8% as of 2012. And since this key provision was gutted in 2013, the gap has started to increase, and it's increased in those states that have a history of making laws that deny people their right to vote based on their race. So in April 2010 is actually when it all started in Shelby County, Alabama, where they filed suit asking for a federal court in Washington, D.C. to declare Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional. Now, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act had required certain jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to submit any proposed changes in voting procedures to either the U.S. Department of Justice or a federal district court in D.C. before it goes into effect to ensure the change would not harm minority voters. So in 2013, what happened is that the Supreme Court essentially ruled that the coverage formula in Section 4B, which is how you determine which states should be included in Section 5, is unconstitutional because it was based on an old formula. So as a practical matter, this meant that Section 5 was inoperable and still to this day is inoperable until Congress enacts a new coverage formula, which the decision invited Congress to do. So that's the first piece of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, is restoring that. And now the second critical Supreme Court case to understand the need for the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is Brnovich versus the Democratic National Committee, which the Supreme Court decided just last year. So this all revolves around Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibited any standard practice or procedure imposed or applied to deny or limit the right to vote on account of race or color. The decision, very unfortunately, held that Arizona's laws, which discounted ballots cast out of precincts and banned non-relative neighbors of friends to deliver mail-in ballots, did not violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, despite these laws' negative effects on Black and brown voters. So there was data that showed the law's negative effects on Black and brown voters. There was also a brief that was filed by the Navajo Nation that noted Arizona's ballot collection law criminalizes ways in which Navajos historically participated in early voting by mail. Due to the remoteness of the nation and lack of transportation, it is not uncommon for Navajos to ask their neighbors or clan members to deliver their mail. So in this instance, we see Arizona specifically targeting these laws that they know help Black and brown voters get their vote to count, and they're taking that power away from them. So in a very unfortunate turn of events, Justice Alito wrote for the majority and declined to set up a test to fully evaluate Section 2 claims, but offered 5 guideposts to consider when evaluating a voting policy. These 5 guideposts were, number 1, the size of burden imposed; number 2, the degree to which it departs from what was standard practice when Section 2 was amended in 1982; number 3, disparities in its impact on members of different racial or ethnic groups; number 4, the opportunities provided by a state's voting system; and number 5, the strength of the state interest, such as interest in preventing election fraud served by a challenged policy. Now, number 5 is really where everything fell apart, where the majority in Brnovich suggested that the most important guidepost was the 5th one, which is protecting the state's interest, such as in preventing election fraud. But the court's majority completely sidestepped the 3rd guidepost, which, as we recall, was the disparate impact. And so that's actually what Justice Kagan championed in her dissent to this decision. And so really, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act remedies both of these guttings of the original VRA. So this, again, was Section 2 and Section 5, by establishing new criteria for determining which state and political subdivision must obtain pre-clearance before changes to voting practices may take effect. So some more details on this to give you a better idea is that there are basically three things that can trigger a state needing to be subject to pre-clearance procedures. So these 3 items are either 15 or more voting rights violations have occurred in the state during the previous 25 years. Number 2, or 10 or more violations occurred during the previous 25 years, at least one of which was committed by the state itself. Or 3 or more violations occurred during the previous 25 years, and the state administers the elections. So states and political subdivisions that meet certain thresholds regarding minority groups must again pre-clear covered practices before implementation, such as changes to methods of election and redistricting. Further, states and political subdivisions must notify the public of changes to voting practices. Next, the bill authorizes the Department of Justice, and this is really mission critical, to require states or political subdivisions to provide certain documents or answer to questions for enforcing voting rights. Because without an enforcement mechanism, we all know what happens to laws without enforcement mechanisms. They are not enforced then, and they are not very effective. So finally, and this was the Section 2 provision, the bill outlines factors courts must consider when hearing challenges to voting practices. For example, the extent of any history of official voting discrimination in the state or political subdivision. So this directly fixes the misstep by the Supreme Court where they decided they didn't have to consider that as a primary factor of influence. So that is the bill in summary, and happy to clarify any further if people need it.
That's an excellent summary, Anne. I'm going to go to Patrick now because we have all been keeping track of what's happening in DC, not a whole lot. And it looks like it's stalled, hopefully not for long, maybe not forever. But I'm going to conclude with Patrick on this question. Patrick, what happens if neither of these proposals is able to be passed? Will voting rights then become the huge mobilizing issue it should be for 2022? What do you think going forward? Patrick.
Absolutely, Diane. We will have to mobilize in a way that we have never mobilized before if these bills are not passed. And I can use some key examples. There have been many states with voter suppression has been in place over a number of years. We can use Florida as a prime example. Florida has had a number of voter suppression laws, voter suppression laws. Florida actually had a law around voter registration where you couldn't register voters unless you were specifically licensed and registered with the state, and third-party organizations could register, and you receive fines if you were registering students. In fact, there was a famous case where a teacher registered her students, and she received multiple tens of thousands of qualifying just around it. And what that did is it caused the Democratic Party, it caused campaigns to become far, far more organized in their efforts. And through that organization, we were able to win Florida. We won in 2012 for the Obama campaign. That's I'm in Florida, just around some of these voter suppression efforts. They also had voter suppression efforts around those that were formerly and essentially had one or two people in the state. For those who had served their time, they had paid their dues to society, and they were trying to restore their voting rights. And essentially, if you had been convicted of a felony at any point in Florida, you were never able to get your rights restored because there were only one or two people that were. They just didn't restore rights. So there were lots of things that we had to do to organize around that, to get out the vote in a big way, and to use those key elements to mobilize people. We're going to have to do very, very similar things if we are not able to pass these two pieces of legislation now. And we can look in a number of states that just they plan to do. And I wouldn't even look at just those red battleground states. They're local states. They're local county clerk's offices that do things to suppress the vote. And we've seen these things locally. We have even seen them in DuPage County. You can think of polling locations where you may just happen to see longer lines. In the past, not now, but previously in the past, you may have seen long lines. There may have been polling locations that students went to, like North Central College, the municipal center. We always saw lines in Naperville at that particular early vote location in some of those polling locations. We can look at locations where there are large minority populations. For some reason, the machines always seem to go great at those particular locations. So what we have to do is we have to be organized. We know that there are early vote locations. We have to be ready and prepared to a day where they can go to vote. Because oftentimes those efforts they use to suppress the vote. And then these battleground states, these key states that we know about, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, other states where we know we have to get out the vote in a big way. We're going to have to make sure that we let people know what's going on and that we get out as many voters as possible. It's going to be a tool that we're going to be able to use to mobilize voters. And we have to look at ways around some of the efforts that they're utilizing.
Thank you, Patrick. I know the article that I quoted earlier from the New York Times talks about Democratic officials and activists say they are resigned to having to spend and organize their way around the new voting restrictions, a prospect many view with hard-earned skepticism, citing the difficulty of educating masses of voters on how to comply with new rules or restrictions or whatever it might be. It would be so much better to have national standards, especially for federal elections.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to have a conversation now to conclude our presentation today, and maybe it'll go on. We'll see where it goes from here. But let's talk about the state of Illinois and the efforts that we have in place to protect the rights of everyone to vote in Illinois. I'm directing this to Ann and Patrick in particular. What changes have been especially beneficial for minority voters in Illinois? Obviously, everyone benefits, but were there some that were especially beneficial for minority voters? Maybe start with Ann?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think we have implemented automatic voter registration as a state, and this is one of the biggest initiatives of people who are trying to fight voter suppression is automatic voter registration, because it just provides the access to vote when someone is going to the DMV to do naturally things that they're going to do, like getting an ID, either a state ID or a driver's license or whatever they happen to be doing there. So I think those are really critical moments where we catch people, we make sure that they're automatic voter registration. We also allow for same-day voter registration now as a state. So people can register at their election site if they need to and vote. And we allow for quite a, I think, expanded access with our ballot drop boxes that we've instituted. But also we've allowed for expanded access insofar as in making sure there's voting centers for the primary and general elections, making a permanent vote by mail list. So if someone votes by mail, they can elect to do so permanently. I think any of these expansions that we see in voting rights are really going to help our minority communities, because if they are in a situation, they're in a situation where voting has been made tougher in many different instances, and making that ease of access, I think, really engenders participation in the political process. Because if you know you're already registered to vote, if you know that you can get a vote by mail ballot and you don't even have to sign up for your vote by mail ballot, you're much more likely to vote than you would have been otherwise. So those are just a couple of the things. Patrick, sorry if I stole a lot. I tried to stop, so I'll leave you a couple, but I can come back in if you need it.
And, you know, I think Representative Stafford is exactly right. She hit on most of the key points. And I think the General Assembly, or the Senate President, Don Harmon, and Speaker Welch, the rest of the General Assembly, they do not give enough credit for how important this legislation was. We have some of the best legislation in the country just around voting and voting access. People being able to be on a permanent vote by mail list, drop boxes, people being able to register to vote the same day. That's absolutely critical to stop a lot of the voter suppression efforts and make access as easy as possible. And for us as organizers, what we can do is we can push people to the polling locations themselves on election day. I cannot say enough of how critical that is, of being able to push people to the polling location on election day versus saying, well, you can't vote because you aren't registered to vote. And it's that way in a lot of other states. And I am happy that we are here in Illinois. We don't have to worry about a lot of those things. I hope that we're able to implement a lot of these things in other states. We should be thankful for what we have in Illinois. We should be ready to utilize the great legislation the General Assembly has passed for this.
Thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add a couple more. I'm going to add just maybe one or two more things that I think are important. So we clarified in our recent laws, we clarified that jails outside of Cook County may set up polling places in their facilities if they so choose. We also made sure that if people are in prison, if the people in the jails are counted in their original home location. And so that's important because the way that with the Voting Rights Act, we abide by those key provisions of the Voting Rights Act when we draw our maps here in Illinois. And so we want people to be able to vote where they can influence an outcome that, like Ken said earlier, can have someone that really understands what they've been through and understands their life experience be representing them at a state level. And so we did allow that for state gerrymandering of prisons and take that away from, they used to have their state representatives were wherever the downstate county representative was. And quite frankly, most of them were Republicans who did not care much for advocating for that population. So I think it's been a good change. We also have voted on, and I'm not sure that, I don't think that it's gone into effect yet, but I did vote to restore voting rights for people currently serving time in prison. And this is really an important provision for minority populations also, who we know get targeted more often by police and can end up in situations of being incarcerated because of the hyper focus on them. And I think the ability for someone, and if we know that the rate of how long someone is given the sentence that they're given can sometimes be related to their race as well. And so if people are serving shorter sentences and happen to have gotten more leniency because of the color of their skin, they're able to vote much faster, or they might get out right away and have their right to vote restored, whereas someone with a darker complexion might have less leniency granted to them in our court system, and they might be serving a longer time where they're not allowed to vote. And so that just is inherently unfair. There's also the so that's really, those are the key things that I wanted to add.
And I was just trying to Google something really quick. Do we have an idea of what the prison population of Illinois is?
That's a very good question that I can look up and get back to you on.
You can Google. That's a fine thing. You were just too quick for me. I couldn't quite get it typed in. But yeah, I am. Well,
I'll keep talking for a second if you want to look for it. But yeah, I mean, the prison population is significant in the state of Illinois. We have been working on de-incarceration policies in terms of finding people who are nonviolent and unlikely to be a repeat offender, to decarcerate and make sure that people are not just locked away forever if they've served their time. And again, when we think about parole, that can be an important topic too if we don't get the right to vote in prison enacted.
Thank you for bringing that topic up. It was one that was off my radar, and it's such an important one. I appreciate it. I was thinking about same-day registration and what a difference that's made over my years in Illinois, which is 40-some years. And same-day registration has eliminated so many of the provisional ballots. And yet people seem to still not quite figure out it takes 2 forms of ID, and we still have a few provisional ballots. And it's been my experience that many voters do not know that they indeed have to make that ballot count by providing another form of ID within the time frame that's available. I learned that in 2018. That was sort of instructive to me. And you would think that I would have picked that up along the way, but it's the voter's responsibility to make that ballot count. And I still think we need to do a little better education on what forms of ID work for same-day registration. I'd like to see that get a little more emphasis.
Yeah, I'm going to be great. And then one last thing, if I can. Go ahead. Sorry. So I just was reviewing my notes and wanted to. So one of the things that we also did is that we required the State Board of Elections to propose legislation to the General Assembly regarding procedures to enable a voter with disabilities to independently and privately mark their ballots. And so we are requiring that they solicit public opinion and have at least 2 public hearings, but we're really looking to make vote by mail more accessible for persons with disabilities as well.
For sure. I'm going to conclude this particular part of the discussion with Ken, and we're going to talk about voter turnout. I gave some statistics earlier, right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and how dramatic the increase was in registrations and in voter participation. And then we closed that gap. It was, I don't know if they were equal, but they were very, very close in 2008 and 2012. How can we keep Black voter participation high? What can we do to improve it? What are your thoughts, Ken?
That's a very good question. So when you look at 2008, 2012, you also have to remember that we had President Obama on the ballot. And that is important because when folks of color can see and envision their dreams and their ideas and their goals in a candidate, it makes us more motivated to go out and vote. And so often, we, especially Black and brown folks, don't get to see ourselves reflected in our politics. And this is something I've said numerous times. DuPage County is the 2nd largest county in the state of Illinois. In 2020, I ran for Illinois State Rep. I was the only African-American male on the ballot on the Democratic or Republican side in the 2nd largest county in Illinois. So when you look at that in the year 2020, you're going to see a lot of Black and brown folks say, well, goodness, why am I not being represented here? Where am I? So that also ties into something called voter apathy. So when you look at Black and brown issues, when they are put to vote and put to law and put to bill, there is a decrease in Black and brown issues being voted upon in a timely manner and passing. Black and brown issues typically get pushed to the back burner. For example, voting rights. This is an issue, as we talk about it, it does really impact Black and brown voters. This is why the can gets kicked down the road so often. Take a look at something like the crack epidemic of the 1980s and the heroin epidemic of the late 1980s, early 90s that infected a lot of urban areas. You saw activists and Black folks pull together to say, we need help. These things are addictive and no one is helping us. We went 2 decades without anything, any legislation, any help being given. What was provided from our elected officials was, okay, we will lock up these drug addicts. We will put them in jail at higher prison sentences than their white counterparts. That will help your problem. That did not help the problem. But now we cut to within the last 5 to 10 years, where opioid addiction has become a huge impact in white suburban communities. Now you hear politicians speak of, we need to help. We need to do better. We have to have rehab facilities. We have to help these folks because addiction is a disease. I don't disagree with that sentiment, but where was that sentiment when Black and brown communities across this country were being ravaged from crack epidemic? Where was it? It was nowhere to be found because Black and brown issues are just deemed not important. What also happens, and I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, Black voters and Black and brown voters tend to not go out to vote because our issues are not voted upon. But then politicians will also say, well, I can put Black and brown vote issues on the back burner because Black and brown people don't vote. So what's happening first? Is it happening simultaneously? I don't know. But what I can tell you is when you acknowledge Black and brown issues, Black and brown folks will come out and vote. And we will vote in large numbers. That is why in Georgia, something that they tried to pass is banning votes on Sundays. Mm-hmm. That is a day where you have a lot of Black folks. We get into the church van, we all go to vote, and then we go and have dinner afterwards. To disenfranchise that is to disenfranchise the Black vote. So to understand how we're seeing the apathy and the fall off with Black and brown vote, you have to understand our cultural trends. And until you understand that, and until you research that, we're always going to see this Black and brown vote apathy. But it's apathy, and I'll say this. There's a story of a man who lived on the same road for 30 years. A politician came to his home, and he said, hey, you lived here for 30 years. Why are you not voting? And they listed all the things that they've done for the community, climate change, you name it, they listed it. And he said, sir, I want you to turn around and look at that street. There's a pothole there. That pothole has been there for the last 20 years, and no one has fixed it. You guys come here to ask money, to ask for votes, but no one is fixing the issues. So when you look at a lot of our traditional Black and brown communities, the same issues that were there today were there 10 years ago, were there 10 years before that. I grew up in Congressional District 1, where I'm no longer there, but the same congressman has been in office since I was in kindergarten or first grade. I can't remember. My point is this is my point. The pothole has still not been fixed. And it is now 30 years later. So you can't, in good faith, go to these folks and say, we want change from the same people that have been saying we want change for the last 30 years without seeing said change. So that is how we increase the Black and brown vote turnout, by actually delivering on the things that Black and brown voters care about.
Well, thank you, Ken. You know, having lived through the civil rights era and seeing it sort of come full circle again, it might be easy to be a bit cynical and wonder if it's ever going to change. And then we've got the issues in D.C. with the legislation that is right there. You can all see it, can't quite take it to the finish line. I know we didn't talk about taking questions from the audience, but I know there's a hand raised. Do you mind if I take it?
Are you asking me if I mind, Diane?
I was going. Yeah, mind. I'm not the host. That's
okay. Right. Well, I'm here now. Ken, okay. I want to agree with much of what you said, but I want to take it a step further. often Black and brown people, and specifically African Americans, feel used. There is not enough community engagement. And then suddenly we are upon an election and everybody wants us to come out and cast a vote. So if we want to see a change, and Mr. Porter raised the question, how do we plan to combat voter apathy? We do just what you're doing now, but we do it, and I think you and I have had this discussion, Ken, with focus groups. We do it at a level where we begin to reach out to small pockets of people in marginalized populations and help them better understand the process. The reason opiate addiction became a greater problem that did not result in it being criminalized is because the parents of these children mobilized, organized, and made their elected officials understand this is a medical problem. And unfortunately, in the Black community, we got promises, promises, promises. And we thought ourselves, I mean, there's a degree of enlightenment that we have to acquire here as a people. We thought ourselves that the end result should just be put them in jail. And look what we have now. So if we really want to change this paradigm, we have to look at it and call it out for what it is. A lot of people in our communities do not feel valued. And therein lies that voter apathy. So how do we make them feel valued right now, where we are right now?
Ken, would you like to try that?
How do we make Black and brown voters feel valued from where they are right now? Well, that is a good question. This is what we do. And it's not about having a monolithic vote. What matters is those voices and those conversations matter. What makes it look like it matters? When the bills are passed, when we are seeing the impact in the communities. It's one thing to invite me to a workshop to hear what I think. It's another thing to sit me down, ask me what I think, and then mobilize to move to help the situation. Mobilize to help to get those bills passed. Mobilize to help get those legislation passed. Is more than just coming to me. And more importantly, let's not ask me what my thoughts are every single time you are running a re-election campaign and then send me an email to ask me to donate to you. Let's keep me invested in the community and in the conversation after the election. Come visit my NAACP, my church, our places of gather after you win the election. Show us that you care by being active. Don't just pop up, sit down, listen, get my vote, and then I don't see you again for another 2 to 4 to 6 years. It's about staying involved and staying active. Fix the potholes. Yes, thank you.
And you know, one of the really successful efforts statewide was the Criminal Justice Reform Bill 3653. I mean, that was one that had strong support from the Black Caucus of the state legislature and crossed the finish line, and it's a success. And on Saturday, we heard from Juliana Stratton, and she was discussing the dollars that are going back into the community. I think it's the 3R committee, Restore, that's part of it. And these are dollars going into
Reinvest Renew.
There you go. And these dollars are going to communities that were disproportionately impacted by laws that disproportionately impacted them. And so there are steps being made in this state, but of course, we're an island in many ways in this nation.
Yeah, and I would note that we're an island, and that bill, HB 3653, the Criminal Justice Reform Bill, specifically that pillar, was incredibly difficult to pass even in our state. And so I think that it's incredibly, I think we can't take for granted the fact that we are an oasis, and, you know, that was a 60 vote bill. So every single person that voted for that bill mattered. So
And when you look at the makeup of our state legislator, and this is where Representative Stavamurray will agree with me, our makeup is very, very representative of our state. We have folks of different age groups in our state house, different racial groups. We have different sexual orientations, different religions. We have so many different folks working down in Springfield to foster these ideas. They don't have that in other states. And that ties back to the gerrymandering we discussed earlier. So when you have a state house that is not composed of any kind of racial makeup, you're not going to see these things pass. Our criminal justice bill would not have passed in our surrounding states because they do not have the same makeup that we do. And that is my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think it's incredibly important to realize that we can't take for granted these things that occur. We have to fight for them. We have to be active, and we have to organize and rally and educate each other on why these issues are important for those of us who they may not impact personally, in your family, et cetera. So depending on your race. So I think it's really important that we listen to our colleagues and we listen to that diverse caucus. Although I would say the diversity is mainly on one half of the aisle. When I look across the way, I don't see very many women or people of color. Let me say that.
And Anne, you get some special credit for helping protect this legislation. I've heard that from many.
Thank
you. Thank you for your efforts in Springfield. We did get from Janet Warfield a number. There are 497 incarcerated people per 100,000 people. Now, I didn't do the math for the total number, but that's a higher percentage than in almost any democracy on earth. Now, maybe she's speaking of the entire country, but I don't know where Illinois is, but it gives you some idea of where we are as a nation. So there are way too many folks spending their lives in prisons in this country and denied the right to vote as well. Maybe somebody can update me. What happened with that in Florida? What are people that have served their time and they're back in society, can they now vote in Florida? Wasn't that restricted after it was passed? Anybody know? Diane? She might know. Diane Pappas?
Yeah, so in Florida, the voters reinstated voting rights, and their wonderful governor, that was the governor pre-DeSantis, I can't remember his name, but he persuaded the Florida legislature to pass a bill that required all of those who were incarcerated to pay back the cost of their incarceration before they were able to vote. So they still can't vote unless they're wealthy criminals, basically.
So that's how you get around a referendum by the people.
Mm-hmm.
That is sad. But we have come almost to the conclusion of our time. If there are questions in the chat, if you want to use that raised hand feature, we're going to let Ken have the last word. But if there are raised hands and you'd like to ask a question, this is your time to do that. Maybe not.
We have a...
Ken?
Oh, yes. Let's do it.
Sandra.
Yes.
Sandra?
Hi. Yeah, so my question is whether either of these voting rights bills are going to preclude state elected officials that are running the voting to preclude them from overturning the results or not accepting results of the voters that they don't agree with.
So this is about the two federal pieces of legislation.
Right.
I did not see that in the Freedom bill. I do not believe it is in the John Lewis bill. Representative Stavamurray, did you? I did not.
I apologize. I had a kid distraction. Can you repeat the question?
I was wondering if either of the voting rights bills preclude a state elected official from either decertifying or not certifying the election results because they disagree with the results.
I don't recall.
Ooh, we lost your audio.
All right. I don't recall seeing that as a provision.
Right. So that is still an issue. We can get people out to vote. But if a state elected official can decertify or not accept those results, we're still behind.
And over, I think it's nearly half the state legislatures are controlled by Republicans. In fact, it may be over half. I think we've got 23. So these elections for governor are coming up in 22 and state legislatures. I mean, it couldn't get more critical. The stakes are so high. Ken, would you like to conclude the presentation?
Sure. So, number one, I want to thank all of you for taking a little bit of time out of your day and joining us today on Dr. King's Day to talk about voting rights. I had a speech prepared, but I'm going to not go with it because it doesn't feel right in the moment that we're in right now. And there are some things that I feel that we have to acknowledge. And it's not to scare anyone, but it's to be honest. Our voting rights are tied directly to the civil rights movement. Sitting here on Dr. King's Day and talking about voting rights, it feels counterproductive. Because these are things that we've been talking about for the last 59 years. So part of me feels excited and energized that we have so many people in a place to talk about these things, but another part of me feels, my God, we've been talking about this for 59 years. When does it change? When does it end? And it ends when we start to accept and remember that all of us, Black, brown, and everyone in between, should have the same access to vote. Access to vote is a trickle down, or as I like to say, a trickle up, because it changes everything. When we talk about unfair judicial sentencing, that goes to the vote. We can vote for our judges. When we talk about, I'm from the south side of Chicago. There was a joke that was always made that when a bad snowstorm came, we would be stuck in for a week while our white counterparts would be out in a couple of days. That joke is still a reality on the south side of Chicago. It's about the representation. The vote is what leads to the representation. As I sit here before you today as the first Black chair of the Democratic Party of DuPage County, one of the first things I wanted to do was look at what we call our vice chair of outreach. And I said, well, outreach. That means that we're going to send someone into marginalized communities, talk, and then retreat. I said, I don't like it. Our vice chair of outreach was removed, and we now have what we call the vice chair of engagement. And his name is Terrell Barnes. And what that means is Vice Chair Terrell Barnes is going into these communities and actually not just going to talk about politics and voting. We're participating in the community. We are going in with something and leaving with knowledge. We are not going in to mine data. We are not going in to mine votes. We're not going in to mine volunteers. We're going in because as Democrats and as African American men in this county, we actually give a damn about these people. That is where we see the change. When we want to talk about voter apathy and how we move forward, giving a damn is how we move forward. If you come into communities, you go into people's homes, and you promise, and year after year after year, they see nothing. Your promises mean nothing. They stay home. That is why people stay home. We've all been lied to one too many times. We've been promised things one too many times that's not delivered. I sit here before you today, proud to sit before you today, because I know that with these bills, we can deliver, because we can actually motivate folks to get to the polls so that we can get people in office that want to see the change. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing it. And in conclusion, I like to go in a reverse a little bit. My grandfather was arrested numerous times in Arkansas for trying to register to vote. My mother was the first Black student at her elementary school in Newton, Mississippi. And as I've said numerous times, I was the first Black chair of the party here in DuPage. All of these stories that have happened over the span of a lifetime have the same positive and the same negative. The negative is we still had to endure. We still had to go through trauma to get to where we are. The positive is we had strong co-conspirators to get us through it. What's a co-conspirator, you might ask? Well, some people say allies. I don't need allies. I don't need people putting up Facebook quotes and special banners once a year to let me know, to signal to me that they actually care about me. I don't need someone telling me that about February being Black History Month and what they do. I need, Black and brown people need, you to work with us so we can do the work together. And that is what the story of my family shows, is that the co-conspirators got in and made our lives easier, worked with us, and inspired change. So that is what we need to do, folks. I'm on a call right now, not with allies. I'm with co-conspirators. So we can get things done. So thank you for joining. Now let's get out there and have some good trouble, folks. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Ken. Good night, everybody.